Welcome back, Richard. It's good to see you this morning.
Good to see you too. Everything okay over there?
Everything is doing very well. And
Okay.
today, I'm excited about this topic because I like talking about parents and parenting.
Yes. Parenting.
Um, we've heard about so many different types of parenting, parenting
Hmm.
strategies, parenting styles, parenting techniques, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
Today we're going to introduce the idea of another type of parenting that we recently heard about, and
Right.
I'm a little bit excited about.
Yeah, it was interesting because it was an article in the Atlantic. It was written by Russell Shaw, and it's called Lighthouse Parenting. Lighthouse, like what guides ships. Lighthouse Parenting. Now, Mr. Shaw, he's the head of the school at Georgetown Day School. He's been working with kids for 30 years and he's a parent himself. So I thought, well, the guy knows what he's talking about. He a lot of experience. Turns out that the book itself, Lighthouse Parenting, was written by a pediatrician, Ken Ginsberg, who has an MD and a master's degree in education, which is an odd combination.
Yeah.
Um, he's a professor of pediatrics at the University of Pennsylvania, and is director of one of their programs, the Center for Parent and Teen Communication. The other thing is the book was published by the American Academy of Pediatrics. So we have this very experienced headmaster, award-winning pediatrician, and the American Academy of Pediatrics. So I thought, well, this might deserve a closer look. The
Mhm.
idea with the parent as a lighthouse is a lighthouse, as you know, is always on. It's always there, but it's stationary. It guides sailors so that they don't go crashing into the rocks because the water's shallower. But the important thing is the lighthouse doesn't go out into the ocean to do any work. It stays where it's built.
Which is so important, which is such a drastic and significant difference from
Mhm.
we've talked about snowplow or lawnmower parenting, and we've talked about
Right.
helicopter parenting, where, the idea is using the same sort of metaphor, they're out in the ocean preparing
Hmm.
the way for the child. And,
Right.
and whereas lighthouse parenting, you're on shore and you're providing warnings, you're putting a spotlight on the potential dangers, but if the sailors choose to continue, then the sailors choose to experience those consequences.
Yeah, I'll be here and I'm going to do what I can, and I was talking to a member of the staff the other day and she said, "Oh, it's sort of like a coach." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, a coach guides and directs and makes decisions, but it's all done from the sidelines.
Right.
The coach doesn't go on the field and do anything. He doesn't get involved in the plays. You were a soccer coach
Right.
for years, and but you did everything for that. You never went out and
Wanted to.
during a match and
Wanted to.
pushed somebody down or helped a kid, ran interference for one of your players. You had to do everything from the sideline. So this idea of lighthouse or a coach, why are we interested in lighthouse parenting? Well, as you said earlier, we're interested in all types of parenting and raising children, um, because we not only deal with families who are struggling with children, raising their children, but we also work with schools who struggle with students who are having difficulties managing their emotions and behavior in a classroom. So,
Absolutely.
so
And
we have this interest in raising children to begin with. Now, as most of you know, especially if you've raised children or you've watched others struggle to raise children, it can be a difficult and demanding task. Now, it's a rewarding task. It's exhilarating because you get to witness the birth, the first steps, the first words, the first everything. And it's also rewarding. It's rewarding, especially in the first 10 years from birth to about age 10 or 11, because you see your children's accomplishments over time. And that's very rewarding to think that, oh, I had a part in this. But it's also exhausting, difficult, expensive. It's exhausting because when they're infants, you're staying up in the nighttime to take care of them. And when they're teenagers, you're staying up waiting for them to come home. So it's exhausting. It's difficult, and it's difficult every day. It's difficult when you're busy. It's difficult when they're bored. It's also expensive. It's going to cost you $250,000 or more to raise each one. And but for me, it was humbling. It was the most humbling experience of my life, both as a parent, because I made a lot of mistakes, but it's also humbling as a professional because sometimes success can be elusive. You want to help families and you want to help kids, but sometimes it just doesn't work out very well for anybody. Okay?
Right. Yeah, and I think it's also humbling as a on both sides, because you do the thing sometimes when you do the things that are the most ideal, most appropriate,
Right.
the best research things
Hmm.
to do, it still doesn't always turn out exactly the way that you would hope it would. And
Right.
that those things make it really difficult and discouraging, and all of that. So yeah, you have this great dichotomy in it's the greatest thing. Remind us of the, in our book we wrote, we quoted the first
Yeah.
page so of the opening section of A Tale of Two Cities. It's the best
Right.
of times, it's the worst of times. And it very much so is both things at the same time.
Right. Yeah. And I love this phrase, this sentence that I stumbled on. It says, before I got married, I had 6 theories about bringing up children. Now I have 6 children and no theories. And that's exactly what happens to us. And the interesting thing about that is that that sentence was written in 1660. Okay. Now, fast forward to today, because a couple of weeks ago we did a podcast where the Surgeon General of the United States recently issued a warning about how stressful it is to be a parent.
Yeah.
So we've been dealing with the stress of being a parent for probably more than 400 years. And this 400-year-old parenting problem, I think centers around one thing, and that is, how do I get this right? How do I do this right?
Well, and it's probably even older than 400 years. They were probably
100 years,
dealing
right?
with this before. And you know, it's so challenging because, again, we do research, and we look at what were the characteristics of parents
Mhm.
whose children became very successful, and what were the
Right.
characteristics of parents whose kids struggled and had more difficulty and had
Mhm.
problems as they grew up. And sometimes there's a lot of overlap, and sometimes there's not very much overlap, and then sometimes it just doesn't matter.
Right.
You have, I remember years ago we used to talk about what was his name, Ben Carlson, who was a neurologist and ended up being in politics. But he came from a horrible neighborhood,
Yeah. Yeah.
a neighborhood where, if you looked at the situation, if you looked at his
Hmm.
parents, and you looked at the neighborhood where he grew up, you would not have very positive,
Predictions.
idea
Yeah.
for where he was going to go. And then,
Right.
he becomes a world-renowned neurosurgeon, and
Right.
goes into politics. So
Right.
even when you think you're getting it right, or even when you think something is going to be all wrong, it still surprises
Right.
you sometimes.
And you mentioned a minute ago that it's probably more than 400 years old. And I just remembered that Socrates, this is
Yeah,
about 2,500 years ago, was complaining about how rude the teenagers were at his
yeah,
time. So I don't think that there's anything new about the struggle of raising children in some way that we would consider right. Um, so how do I get this right? Well, first of all, what is this? And when we say, how do I get this right? What is this? What is this task? I'm watching my son and daughter-in-law. She's pregnant. And I know that they're thinking about what are they going to do when this will be a first child for them. And I know that they're thinking about what should they do, what shouldn't they do. They're probably thinking about, well, I'm not going to do what my dad did, that we all do that. But I'm gonna do these things. Okay. So what is the task? How do they conceptualize the task? And the other thing is, what do you mean by right? When you say, I'm going to do this right, how will you know
Yeah.
that you've done the right thing? And then when will you know it? Because everything might be going fine when they're 5, but that's just the beginning of a very long journey. All right.
Right.
And when you say, I want to do it right, do you mean what's right for you or what's right for the child? Because those frequently can be very different things.
Mhm.
Um, we want our children to be a certain way, but children have their own personalities and they're going to become kind of what they want to become despite everything that we do.
Absolutely. And so raising kids, proposes and introduces several unique challenges, right?
Right.
We've talked many times before on the idea that over the course of childhood, over the course of raising your children,
Mhm.
the approach that you take is going to have to adjust and shift. So there's no single theory. I
Right.
don't know of one that you can find a single theory that works throughout the first 2 decades of your child's life that you're going to stick with. What you need to do those first 3 to 5 years is very different than what you do during the teenage years. And
Right.
so
Right.
you have to recognize that things have to adjust, things have to be modified over the course of those 20 years or so, so that you're meeting the child's needs at the time of the child's where they are developmentally. It's going
Yeah,
to be
you really put your finger on the pulse there because what you do with a kid in the first 3 years of life, from birth to say age 3, that's attachment parenting. You want to
right.
get as close and be as close to that kid as possible. You get to puberty, you get to the teenage years, and it's just the opposite. You want to start to detach because now this child has to become an adult, right? And so what you're doing at one age might be completely different from what you have to do at another age. So there's no single theory that covers everything that you're going to have to do in the first 18 or 20 years of a child's life.
Absolutely. And so it's constantly changing. And so, you can think of it as like white water rafting, right?
Right.
It's ever changing, ever challenging, and
Right.
what you just experienced, 10 feet behind you is not what you're going to experience 10 feet in front of you. It's
Right.
while just, but do remember that, just as, when you get to those calm areas, you have to know that those won't last.
Mhm.
When you get to those really difficult and challenging times, they won't last either. You'll get through those as well.
Yeah, if there was anything I would want my son, he's just a few months away from being a father, I want him to understand is that this is going to be different every day. I mean, you're about to enter a fast movie. This isn't a still painting. Parenting is a being a parent is a very fast moving experience. Okay, it changes constantly. So
Absolutely.
let's go back to 1660. It's interesting that that person who said there's no theory. It's also about the same time that the verb to parent first appeared. Interesting juxtaposition. And then if you go up to 1918, the word parenting, this verb to parent, was first cited in a dictionary. It's like the word adulting, parenting. Now we talk about adulting.
Yeah.
So it was the adulting of its day. And in 1975, and this is an important date, the 1970s, by 1975, the word parenting had overtaken the term child rearing.
Right.
So the emphasis, and I think this is an important shift in this world of raising children, that in 1975, in the middle 70s, parenting started to replace child rearing. And parenting became a sort of status symbol,
Well,
like a talent that you know.
yeah. And I think, if you just, because words are important, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Look at the
Mhm.
words parenting, child rearing. What is the emphasis? Child rearing, the emphasis is the child.
Right.
Parenting, the emphasis is the parent.
Exactly.
So,
Right.
so
Mhm.
the emphasis is very different. And as we then look at how we've thought about parenting since then,
Right.
Everything has been about what is the parent doing,
Correct. That's right.
which is very different than what is the child doing.
Right. That's right. I think of teaching,
Mhm.
what's important is what the teacher is doing, or is the child learning anything? You could have a great lesson plan, but if the kid isn't learning anything, it's
Right.
worthless. Okay. So you're right. The emphasis shifts to parent from children to parents, and it creates this multi-billion, because now you have, being a parent like taking a class. It's an endeavor. It's something you have to get good at, and to get good at it, you have to learn about it, and you have to study it, and you have to get the right things and do the right things. Well, that creates inevitably this multi-billion-dollar industry that attracts, because of all the money involved. I mean, we're talking about $46 billion of materials. It's going to attract professionals, influencers, parents, non-parents, who have a lot of advice and a lot of stuff to sell these parents who want to get it right all the time. There's a lot of anxiety in being a parent. And so people are going to offer you all kinds of solutions to get this right. And in fact, there's Forbes magazine, the business magazine, calls it the new mom economy.
Right.
And this is all the stuff that parents buy. It's worth $46 billion a year.
Yeah.
That's not an insignificant amount of money, and it's going to attract a lot of attention. It's going to attract a lot of advice, a lot of books, a lot of materials. Okay. One of the funny things about parent is we hear that the children don't come with an instruction manual. Okay, we often hear that, they don't come with a manual. Well, if you go to Amazon and you click
Ah,
parenting books, it generates 35, almost 36,000 hits. And if you go to Google and search for parenting advice, you get 104 million.
right.
So I think there's plenty of manuals out there. I don't think the problem is a dearth of manuals. I think there's plenty of manuals, but we got plenty of instruction. So why are we struggling so much?
Well, and I think I think part of it, what is interesting, you said something a minute ago that like is just tickling my brain, and that is they want to get it right. And it goes along with this whole idea of there is a right answer, that there has to be, a right way to do it. There's got to be a wrong way to do it, and there's got to be a right way to do it. And sort of looking at so many of these sort of human dynamic
Mhm.
abstract constructs,
Right.
but trying to, we talked a few months ago about, trying to find a simple solution to a complex problem.
Mhm.
It's sort of the same thing. We're trying to find and make something, find a correct answer, a correct way to do something where every child that you have is different. And
Correct.
every child you have is going to require something different. And because of that, there is no way that there is a right answer. There's no way that there is a one right thing that's going to fit for everybody. It just
Mhm.
doesn't happen.
That's right. Even within the same family,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
and as we said earlier, even with the same child, because what you do when they're 5 years old is going to be very different, going to require a whole different set of skills and interventions when they're 15. All right.
Right.
And so there's this dynamism, this dynamic flow of parenthood. So there is no single unified, in physics, they talk about a unified field theory, like there's this single explanation for how things work. That doesn't exist in child rearing.
Right.
There's no single theory that's going to work. There's no right answer. I think that's the first, there is no right answer. So we have lots of manuals, we have lots of advice from all kinds of people. So why do we have, for me, one of the questions, why do we have so many kindergarten kids who are having emotional meltdowns
Right.
and having to get suspended and kicked out of schools? They're 5 years old. Where it was unheard of a generation ago. Why do kids function with impunity? I think of that. Um, you told me a story the other day about a kid who threatened to punch his teacher because she asked him to not be in a particular place in the hallway. They weren't supposed to be in a particular hallway, and she said, "Hey, you guys are supposed to be somewhere else. You're not supposed to be up here." And the kid threatened to punch her in the face. You know, Where's that? Okay. Why do college kids need trigger warnings? Colleges are one of the safest places. I mean, you have to give trigger warnings. You have to warn, there's no safer place than a college. Why do college students who should be there expanding their worlds need trigger warnings because they might want to walk out of the room if there's some topic? And finally, why is there this epidemic of anxiety, depression, and ADHD, especially in teenagers? And we hear about it all the time. Okay. So there's lots of questions that, well, if there's all this advice and all this stuff, why are we still struggling with these? Why are things getting worse? Okay.
Right. Yeah.
And one of the explanations is maybe that when parenting replaced child rearing.
Yeah.
Now, Bernie,
And this is a place where, we're gonna maybe some people think
violate.
that's the wrong way.
We're going to violate one of our principles.
Yeah. Because there are we'll put it in quotations, parenting experts
Mhm.
who talk about things in ways that are very, in quite in opposition to the way that we should be thinking about it, or the way that we think that we should be thinking about things. For example, and we'll say his name. There's a very well-known person around the country who writes in lots of newspapers. Is
Mhm.
Dr. John Rosemond, and the way that he writes and talks about kids sounds like he is just angry with children, like they are the enemy.
Right, right,
He writes as though, and he encourages parents to treat kids as though kids are the enemy. They need to be squashed. They need to be pushed down and kept under, under your thumb throughout childhood.
right,
Um, and if they dare step out of that, you have the parents' bill of rights, you have the kids' bill of rights, and those bill of rights say that, well, the parents should be able to punish you and do whatever they need to do to you to get you to comply.
that's right.
And my goodness, that um, you know maybe we can acknowledge that, yeah, that could have been a very common way of parenting, 70, 80 years ago.
Yeah.
But that is
Mhm.
not the way that we can parent now. We just can't parent that way now.
Right. Yeah, it's sort of the authoritarian. We're going to
Very
talk about
authoritarian.
parenting styles. This is a classic example of the authoritarian parent who says, we are going to do this my way, and if you don't comply, you're going to suffer. You're
Right.
going to suffer painfully, not physically. I don't know that he advocates. I have to be careful when you advocate spanking because there's that fine line between abuse and discipline. But it's a very painful punishment. I mean, hours and days and weeks of denial of privileges and things that are really, really harsh and excessive for what seem like relatively minor transgressions or
Mhm.
what we would call misbehavior, that just kids behaving like kids. But I guess there are times when you need a heavy hand, but you don't need a heavy hand every time, and you don't need a heavy hand with every child. One of my kids was really, really easy. Two of them were really easy, and I never really had to be rough or punitive with them. They sort of did the right thing. But man, he advocates you lower the hammer every time they step out of line, and until they learn to be obedient.
Right.
However, that said, I think that Rosamond makes a very valid point when he says that parenting today is what the vast majority of parents have been doing since the 1970s. And we talked about the 1970s when this whole idea of parenting. And what he's talking about is making kids the center of the world, that parents will put the kid in the center of the world. Now, there's a whole list of things. We don't have to read all of them, but you
Right.
know the kind of stuff we're talking about. It's you know, arranging play dates for children who are younger than 3. That doesn't make any sense because children do parallel play. They don't play with other kids. They play. They're not communicating with each other. They play separately. Throwing these lavish birthday parties. I'm going to have a 1-year birthday party, which your child isn't going to remember, but you're going to have elephants and clowns and cowboys at this party. Well, that's not for the kid because this kid doesn't care. This is for the parent.
Right. Yeah, and yeah, he there's a whole list of things, and but they are the things that people do. People, when parents do the homework for the kids, when
Yeah.
I met with a couple of parents last week, and they will stop whatever they're doing,
Yeah.
no matter what they're doing. They will stop whatever they're doing if their
Hmm.
kid wants them to play with them or
Right. Hmm.
has, you know, and it is not, it's just not healthy for a child to think or to grow up believing that their every wish and command and expectation is going to be met anytime they make it.
Right.
It's just
When
not
I'm,
healthy for a person to grow up that way.
it's always discouraging to me when I'm on the phone with a parent and we're having a conversation and one of their children enters their sphere and asks a question, doesn't say excuse me or can I just, they just start talking and the parent stops the conversation with me and starts to attend to a child. Man, I knew that I had to wait until my parents were off the phone. If it was an emergency, I had to somehow signal that. But I couldn't just interrupt my parents if they were in the middle of a conversation.
Right.
But today we allow kids to do that. Also, and this is where I think all of us can agree, that parents go to great lengths to ensure that their children never experience any frustration, any hardship, defeats, failures, that they're never insulted, they're never rejected, that anything that has anything to do with real life, they're protected from. Okay, we
Right.
shield them from all these life things that they should be experiencing. Okay,
Absolutely. And
like
that's all of that is what we would classify as, this umbrella of parenting.
that's parenting, right?
When
Yeah.
we think about child rearing, again, the focus is on the child, and we're trying to, there's been a lot of discussion lately because of the political climate that we're living in. A
Right.
lot of focus on this word character. Um,
Hmm.
but child rearing focuses on the child's character rather than any particular achievement. So, rather than, making sure that they make an A in math, we're trying to make sure that they grow up with the characteristics and character traits that where they're going to put forth good effort and they're going to try their best and they're going to work hard at what they're doing. That is the character trait that we want them to have. Who cares what grade that they get? If they can build that character trait, that's what's going to make them more successful as an adult.
Yeah, you can have a straight A student who's obnoxious and
Yeah.
demanding
And lots of them.
and that's not a good trade. So you're building character rather than achievement. You instill a respect for others as opposed to your own self-esteem.
Right.
Children who are emotionally resilient, who can contain their emotions, who can
Right.
self-regulate. Um, and it's okay to allow kids to experience some frustration, some hardships and disappointments. Those are the things that build the character that you really want. Okay.
Right.
Now, the question is Lighthouse Parenting an answer to this? And I think at least from what we know about it so far, it looks like a promising approach and an antidote to this kind of overindulgent parenting.
Right.
Because what the lighthouse parent does is it stands there stationary as steady and is a reliable guide.
Hmm.
That's what it's doing.
Right.
So that parent is a guide.
Right. It's
Mhm.
providing safety. It's letting them know that, hey, there's dangers here. Be mindful. And again, but thinking about character, then the child is going to choose: am I going to go towards the rocks, or am I going to steer clear? And so, it allows the child to make some of those decisions independently, so that they're
Right.
experiencing the positive and negative consequences of some of those decisions while still sort of under the protection and guidance of the parent. And I think that the image makes sense.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. So the lighthouse parent says here's the danger, but it's up to you to avoid it.
Right.
Okay, and here's the boundary. I'll give you support. I'll show you where the safe passage is, but it's really up to you to navigate it. So it looks like this idea of a lighthouse parent is supportive without being directly involved. And I think, one of the articles we read said, I think it was Rosemond who said, "You're not a butler to your children." Or no, it wasn't. It was Bill Maher, which
Right.
we're going to talk about in our next podcast because we have a second part to this podcast. And Bill Maher said, "You become a butler to your 5-year-old," and
Right.
that's and some parents do. You're not a cleaning lady. You're not a playmate. You're not the cruise director for your children. Your children have to entertain themselves. Okay, you're a guide. You set an example, and you're a decision maker. All
Right.
right, that's your role as a parent. And what many parents are doing is they're exhausting themselves
Hmm.
trying to be everything for their children all the time.
Right.
They're not doing the child's not learning how to be self-sufficient and self-regulating, and the parent is exhausting himself trying to keep up and trying to provide everything for the child. So I
Absolutely.
think the lighthouse idea of a lighthouse parent may provide some promise, and we'll talk about that in a second half of this podcast.
That's right. Yeah, that's it for today. We will pick up and talk more about lighthouse parenting and parenting in general in the next podcast because this is always fun stuff to talk about. So, all
Yeah.
right. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.